All right, I see it's 1 o'clock. You ready to get started there, Andreas?
Yeah, let's go for it.
All right, fantastic. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our presentation this afternoon regarding youth and cannabis use in the current landscape in Canada. My name is Steve Keller. I am the bilingual curriculum developer for the YMCA's Youth Cannabis Awareness Program, a national awareness raising initiative funded by the Substance Use and Addiction Program through Health Canada. And joining me this afternoon, we have Andreas Ariza, our Education Awareness Coordinator from British Columbia. How are you today, Andreas?
Hi, Steve. Good afternoon. I'm doing great. Thank you. I'm very excited to be presenting with you today.
Thank you. We're very excited to have you. Now, before we get started, I would like to take a little bit of a moment here to acknowledge the land in which I'm presenting from. I personally am presenting from Peterborough, Ontario, Canada, the land of the Mississauga Anishinaabe, adjacent to the Haudenosaunee territory. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge the Anishinaabe community, as well as the Indigenous peoples across Canada, as the stewards and care providers for the land. And very much we appreciate the ongoing and consistent work of all of our Indigenous communities across the country.
Absolutely. And on my end, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that where I am joining you from is the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, who have been caretakers of the land for thousands of years and to this day continue to be knowledge holders on how to create a harmonious relationship with it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And as those of you are joining us this afternoon, I can see there are still more people getting logged in as we speak. We'd like to welcome you all for coming today and thank you all very much. The presentation that you're going to be seeing over the next 60 minutes is really a data capture and a snapshot of the 4 major national surveys that we've seen done over the past number of years regarding cannabis use across Canada, particularly for youth in around the 12 to 24 demographic. What we hope to do through this presentation is actually kind of 2 things. First of all, we want to sort of explain the data and the research and the information to sort of give a little bit of an identification on where the youth trends of cannabis use are. However, more importantly, as this presentation is designed for adults involved in youth lives, we want to make sure that we can prepare every single person in this presentation who may be involved in the well-being of a youth, whether that's the parents that are here, educators, researchers, care providers, frontline care providers, with the knowledge and sort of the skills that are needed to really have an open and a meaningful and an impactful discussion with youth about cannabis use. Those are really our 2 biggest goals for today. Now, before we get too far into the presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about what it is that we do. So for those of you that may not be familiar, YCAP is a free national education prevention initiative funded by Health Canada and delivered by the YMCA of Greater Toronto across our nation. YCAP offers educational prevention programs for youth ages 12 to 24, as I mentioned, in addition to the workshop that we see today for adults, parents, guardians, and professionals involved in youth lives. Now, YCAP offers a various sort of degree of services and sort of options for youth and parents and educators to access, including workshops and webinars like today, all of which are free, as well as a youth cannabis knowledge hub, which will be getting launched here in the next couple of weeks on our website. We have self-guided online modules, youth engagement projects, community involvement initiatives, as well as parent and school engagement opportunities. We sit on external committees, we chair our own awareness partnership committees, and we actually just recently wrapped up an annual Youth for Youth digital media awareness contest. Now, if you want to learn any more about sort of the information of what our program offers, you can visit our website at youthcannabisawareness.ymcagta.org, or you can contact us anytime by email at YCAP, that is YCAP, at ymcagta.org. Now, I do see a couple questions popping up in the question panel as we are going to be presenting for the next 60 minutes. If anyone does have any questions, we will try to get to them as we're presenting. If you have anything you'd like to know, you can type those questions into the chat panel, and either Andreas or myself will get to them as quickly as we possibly can.
If I may, Steve, questions that are being popped up right now, they are pertaining not being able to hear the sound. So do you have any troubleshooting tips for our audience?
All right. So for those of you that may not be able to hear the sound, there was a message I had up in the chat panel. Andreas, do you mind kind of typing that in as well? That people that may be having issues with sound sometimes go to a webinar. What you have to do is just log out, and then log back in. Or the other option is by using the control panel that GoToWebinar offers. There's an audio section. You can set that to no audio and then set it to the audio that you desire. Would you be able to type that? Because I know the people that can't hear me won't be able to have heard my troubleshooting.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just getting it across my screens here.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. So while you do that, I'm going to jump us on to the next slide here to talk a little bit about who it is that we are and what it is that we do. So in terms of our program, every time you see a YCAP presentation or initiative, you'll always hear our staff start off by talking about three things. And the first thing that we talk about is the idea that we are cannabis neutral. Now, Andreas, when I talk about being cannabis neutral, what am I getting at there? What am I saying?
It means that we neither promote nor create value judgments about recreational cannabis use. We understand that people will choose to use it, whether it's legal or not. And instead of, again, creating a value judgment, we try and minimize risks associated with it by providing youth and adults with the most accurate and unbiased information that we possibly can.
Absolutely. And from there, it really explains the second part of where we're at. Our job is to promote a balanced perspective. You mentioned we don't want to introduce bias. Our job is to sort of project as much of the facts and knowledge and research from an evidence-based lens as we can possibly provide to look at promoting positive youth development. Our job is not to try to sway opinions or tell people that if they don't use cannabis, they should, or if they do use cannabis, they should completely stop 100%. Our job is simply to provide you with the facts that you can make your own informed decisions. Now, the third thing that we talk about is harm reduction. Now, Andreas, what am I talking about when I say harm reduction?
As I was saying earlier, we understand that people have the power of choice at the core of their identity, and people are going to choose to engage in any kind of behavior, whether it's legal or not, whether it's harmful or not. And instead of, again, creating a value judgment around it, we try and provide people with knowledge so that they can know the safest ways for engaging in an activity, in this case, recreational cannabis use. In the scope of our discussion, a very popular harm reduction tip that people often give out is, if you are new to cannabis, start slow and go slow. That means don't do a higher quantity that you think your body is going to be able to tolerate if you don't know what the perceived effects are going to look like in your body.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it any better myself. Now, we do have a poll question here that we want to start off with. Andreas, do you want to lay out the poll there?
Absolutely, Steve. And if you want to help me getting back to the comments in the chat and the questions panel, that'd be great. So the way we're going to run our presentation as we move along is we have created a series of poll questions here and there to keep the engagement going with our audience and to get a little bit of a feel as to where everyone's knowledge on cannabis in Canada is at. So this is just first question. We're going to read the question, read the 4 options, and then I'm going to give you a few moments to choose the best option on this panel that I'm going to pop up now. So let's try with this one. What is cannabis? A plant used for medical purposes, a plant used for non-medical or recreational purposes, a plant whose use during teenage years may impact the brain, or all of the above. Now, collecting responses. Let's see what we have. 98%. Oh, let's look at it. 98% of our audience said all of the above, Steve.
98% of the audience would be exactly right. The answer is really all of these answers are correct to all sorts of extents based on where the conversation is going. If we were to try to describe cannabis, we know it's the scientific name for the hemp plant. We've also heard expressions for it like hash, marijuana, weed. There are all sorts of names for it. The operational definition we tend to use is cannabis. And we know that cannabis has a long history of use for all sorts of purposes, not just for being inhaled for medical or non-medical purposes. It's been used over the years for fiber from the plant's stems, proteins from the seeds, oil and inhalable products, and for the aforementioned medical and recreational treatments. Now, its leaves and flowers also contain a psychoactive substance known as THC, which we will discuss a little bit more later, that changes the way that we think, feel, and act. So cannabis really can be taken in many different ways in conversation. That's why we kind of wanted to start off with that definition to show that we understand there's really an all-encapsulating term here. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that we looked into 4 major national surveys over the last number of years. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge these sort of 4 surveys that were done across the country and tell you a little bit about each one. So the first one is the Canadian Tobacco, Alcohol and Drugs Survey. Without going into too much detail, this is a survey that was collected every couple of years over the phone, interviewing Canadians ages 15 and up. The most recent of the CTADs is back in 2017, at which point there were about 16,000 Canadians interviewed across 10 provinces, with data collected from February to December. Now, The next survey data we looked at was the Canadian Student Tobacco, Alcohol, and Drug Survey. Been collected every 2 years since 2014. Previously, it was known as the Youth Smoking Survey. The most recent survey sample was in 2018-2019. I'm certain due to the pandemic and other circumstances, it sort of led to the next set of reporting data being delayed. However, I have heard that the CSTADS has received funding, and we should be seeing a new CSTADS coming out later this year or next year. The third one that we looked at was the National Cannabis Survey. This is if you look on the Stats Canada website or Stats Cannabis website, you will often see data reported from the National Cannabis Survey. This was a quarterly survey conducted over a 2-year window around the period of legalization, including data from the 4 quarters of 2018 and 2019, with an average sample size per survey of approximately 5,000 to 7,000 Canadians. And the final set of reporting data we looked at was the Canadian Cannabis Survey, most recently completed last year in 2020, surveying Canadians ages 16 and up, with a sample size between 10,000 to 13,000 people per survey. And this was also the only surveying data that we saw before that included some data from the territories as well as the provinces.
Now, one of the things that all of these surveys that Steve just mentioned looked into was the average age at which Canadian youth first tried cannabis. So what do we think here? What is the average age that Canadian youth first tried? 12, 14, 16, or 18 years old? Feel free to choose one of the options here. I saw some people jotted down their answers in the chat. This poll interface is interactive, so you can choose your option here as well. Yeah. And I'm just going to give the audience a couple more moments, Steve. I see that our entries are changing.
That's okay. All right.
Let's go with what we have here. 63% of our audience got the right answer. 14 years old is the average age.
All right. 14 is the average age that Canadian youth first try cannabis. Now, this is a bit of a complicated response, so just bear with me. What we have seen is that the average age of initiation of cannabis for youth is around 14 years old. Now, this is consistent with the national average of about 13 years old for the first consumption of alcoholic beverages, which really brings up the idea that substance use prevention programs like ours and like various others that we see across the country, they need to be started early. We know that legalization for cannabis ranges between 18 in Alberta, 21 in Quebec, and 19 everywhere else. But if youth are trying a substance for the first time in their teen years, it's important to really have awareness and education and prevention efforts beginning early on, because that's the point when the intervention has the best possible chance of sort of interrupting or stemming that use. Now, if you look at the data on the right-hand side, what you'll see is the different surveys actually reported a different first-time use. But the reason that we went with the 14-year range is the 2 surveys that reported 14 years as the average age, these were survey data that collected specifically for Canadian youth. The Canadian Tobacco, Alcohol, and Drug Survey and the CCS both looked at Canadians of all ages. And what they found was that the average age ranged somewhere between 16 years and 20 years. But what each of them noted was that younger demographics reported trying cannabis at a younger age. The CTADS kind of summed it up quite well, saying that people over the age of 25 said the first time they tried cannabis was around 19, but youth around 15 to 19 were reporting the first time they tried was around age 16. So even though the average age, as we can see from the Canadian Cannabis Survey, has been moving up amongst all ages of Canadians, the average age for youth remains around 14 years of age. Did that make sense, Andreas? Did I explain that right?
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better.
Thank you, I appreciate it. It's a tricky one. Next question.
All right, so we know that youth are starting to use cannabis at age 14 in average. Let's ask ourselves now, what age group has the largest percentage of cannabis users in Canada? Do we think it's youth between the ages of 15 to 24, or 25 to 44, 45 to 64, or people in the age bracket of 65 up? Thank you everyone for being very timely with entering your votes. I can see that almost all of our participants have cast a vote, Steve. So let's just go with what we have here.
Perfect.
And the majority of our audience thinks that 25 to 44 is the age bracket that has the highest percentage of cannabis users in Canada. However, it would be the second bracket, 41% of our audience who thinks 15 to 24. There'll be more towards the right answer here.
Absolutely. We know that the age group that actually represents the largest percentage of has the largest percentage of cannabis users is actually a younger demographic. It's ages 15 to 24. Now, there is a bit of an increase that happens by age group, and we saw this in many different surveys. So the CTADs reported in 2017 that youth ages 20 to 24 report the highest rate of use at about 33%, followed by the age 15 to 19. And that age group actually had a higher prevalence of cannabis use than adults age 25 and up. Now, one thing about the CTADs was that they didn't report on genders other than male or female. So they reported that 19% of males overall reported past year cannabis use and about 11% of females. The Canadian Cannabis Survey found something consistent, although their numbers were a little bit higher. They reported that young adults ages 20 to 24 had the highest prevalence of cannabis use, followed by youth age 16 to 19. Again, reporting males had a higher rate of use compared to females. Now, the other thing about the CCS was they also reported findings by sex at birth, and that higher rates of use were reported across all age groups. But one thing that was noted in the CCS report was that this could have actually been the result of a participation bias. When participants in this survey were asked to fill it out, they were told before beginning the survey that this was specifically about cannabis use, and the researchers posited that there was a possibility that people would be more likely to take the survey if they actually used cannabis. So there was a possibility that these numbers here may actually have been a little higher than they might be really reflective of. Okay.
Excellent. Sorry, I was just answering to someone in the chat who asked what were some of the limitations of this study, and you just answered the question right then and there.
Perfect.
Now, looking at the trends in each age bracket may give us an indication to the answer of our next question, but let's roll it out anyways. So cannabis use increases or decreases with age and grade among Canadian youth. Let me bring it up here.
Now, one thing, and I forgot to mention about the CTADs, one limitation of the CTADs back in 2017 was these surveys were done over the phone. So individuals who maybe wouldn't answer their phone or are more likely to use texting or apps may not have actually answered the CTADs. So that's where you may have seen limitation.
Interesting. And just a few more moments here, Steve. Not everyone has cast a vote just yet.
All right.
Okay, we have good representation here from our audience, so let's see what they answered. 3/4 of them think that youth increase their use with age and grade in Canada, and 3/4 of them would in fact be correct.
Absolutely. Now, this was sort of hinted at in the previous question, and that we saw that use increase between the 15 to 19 to 20 to 24. But we even saw an increase of cannabis use by grade, according to the Student Tobacco, Alcohol, and Drug Survey. Now, what they found was that cannabis use was increasing by age and grade between the grade 7 and 12, from about 2.4% in grade 7, jumping to 5.8 in grade 8, 12.5 in grade 9, all the way up to about 37.7% of youth in grade 12 reporting past year use by the age of grade 12. So we do see that there is an increase here.
All right, next up, and let me just pull it up here. Cannabis use increased substantially or decreased substantially, or perhaps it did not change in any substantial way after legalization? This is basically the million-dollar question that we're asking ourselves here in Canada.
And this was probably the hardest one to answer.
All right, 60% of our audience has voted in so far. Just a few more moments, Steve, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope that folks that were having issues with the sound were able to troubleshoot it. I haven't gotten any more messages about these, but just in case anyone was wondering, we are recording the session.
Yeah, it will be posted up on our Cannabis Hub within the next couple of weeks.
All right, let's go with what we have here. Most people seem to think that it did not change in any substantial way, followed by increased substantially, and very few people think that it decreased substantially.
Okay. Like I said, this was probably the hardest one to really answer in sort of a coherent manner, shall we say, because one thing that we found in researching throughout all these data captures and surveys was that the research really showed a lot of inconsistency. And we'll show you what we did. Our answer that we found was that there wasn't really a substantial change. Now, bear with us, this is a bit of a tiered response. First, we looked at the National Cannabis Survey results between 2018 and 2019. And the NCS reported that use among Canadian youth ages 15 to 24 did not really increase in the months following legalization. What they found was that the corresponding rates remained fairly consistent, about 27.6 to 26.4%. Now, they did show that use at all older ages did increase after legalization. But one of the things that came up in the NCS of interest was that use among 15 to 17-year-olds reported use declined from 19.8% to 10.4%. But this was noted with a limitation to be used with caution due to a low sample size and a wide variability. Now, past 3-month cannabis use in the 18 to 24 range did go up a little bit, jumped from about 30.9 to 33.3%. But so the NCS would have reported a substantial decrease amongst teens and a little bit of a decrease amongst youth. Next up, we looked at the Canadian Cannabis Survey, and we saw these numbers a moment ago, but we're going to look at them again real quick. The Canadian Cannabis Survey did show an overall increase in cannabis consumption from 2018 to 2019 across all age groups, including the 16 to 19, which actually showed the highest percentage increase from 36% to 44%. But as we mentioned a few minutes ago, participants in the survey were told that this was specifically about cannabis use, and there was a bit of a participation bias that was estimated. So it is possible that these numbers themselves were also overrepresented. It could have created a bias that skewed this survey's results. So both did show a change, but they both noted a limitation in reporting that change. So then we looked at the CSTATs, the Canadian Student Tobacco, Alcohol and Drug Survey. We looked at the 2016-2017 reporting period and the 2018-2019 reporting period. And that period of time took place from October of 2018 around legalization to June of the following year. And the CSTATs only showed a very slight increase of about 1.4% in consumption for grades 7 through 12. Now, one thing that we want to mention about this, and this is what's important for adults to understand when they're speaking with youth, is that many youth tend to overestimate the rates of use. They may assume that people around them are more likely to have used cannabis than they actually are. And since that belief or that misconception of use can influence the decisions, it's really important to communicate with youth that the rates are actually much lower than they think. So it's worth noting that while 18.1% of high school age students at this time reported cannabis use, that would mean that 81.9% of youth in grades 7 to 12 did not report use of cannabis in the past 12 months. Now, we even looked at this on a provincial scale. We thought, is there a trend? Are they all going up? Are they all going down? And the only consistency we found was that there wasn't really a consistency. BC, there was a fair increase. Alberta went up about 1%. Saskatchewan, not that much of a change. Manitoba and Ontario, small changes. Newfoundland went up a bit. Nova Scotia's reporting dropped from 29.2 to 23.4. PEI had a decrease. Now, New Brunswick didn't participate in the 2016-2017 CSTADS. That's why there's no report here. So we saw a slight increase, but it wasn't a substantial jump. It wasn't a 5% jump. It wasn't a 10% jump, and it wasn't a 5 or 10% decrease. So really, there wasn't a massive change caused by legalization in the research that we saw. Now, Andreas, if we're talking about all of these numbers around cannabis prevalence and people, whether or not they choose to use, why do you think that youth might choose to use cannabis? What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's not one single or linear answer to this. I think there's many different reasons why. It could be for enjoyment, or perhaps they're looking to experiment. Maybe they're curious to fit in their social circles. Some might use it as self-medication, because also cannabis is used medicinally, but some people will not get a medical license and they'll just self-medicate. Or perhaps dealing with stress. And this is taken from the Canadian Students from Sensible Drug Policy. They created an educational toolkit for youth. So these are the reasons that youth listed are the most prevalent for them. However, it is important to note that the reason why someone starts using cannabis might not be the reason why that person continues to use cannabis. For example, someone is using it to fit in their social circle with their friends and peers, and then they end up taking a liking to it, and then they end up using it as an umbrella coping mechanism for a lot of things, and they can use it for self-medicating and for dealing with stress and for coping with unpleasant feelings, you know, and ultimately what that shows us is that, again, what I was saying earlier, the reason why someone continues to engage in cannabis use might not be the same reason why they started doing it in the first place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Next poll question.
Yeah, and if you don't mind giving me a hand with one of the questions that was asked in the chat while I roll this out, Steve, because I knew this was coming, so I haven't had a time to get back to that.
Absolutely.
But we see lots of reasons for using cannabis. Does this make cannabis the most popular substance among youth in Canada? So let's have a look. Is it the first, second, third, or fourth most used substance in Canada? Okay, most of our voting is in. Almost all of our participants have cast a vote. Steve, let me know when you're ready and I'll show the answers, or the results rather.
Absolutely, I am ready whenever you are.
Amazing, so let's go with this representation. 62% of our voters say that it's the second most used substance in Canada by youth. 30% say it's the first. We're gonna give it to people who said that it was the second most used substance.
Absolutely. Sorry, I was just answering another question there too. So yeah, you are correct. It is the second most used substance. Now, we looked at this. This was fairly consistently reported along a lot of the data that we looked at. What the CTADs found in 2017 was that alcohol was the most used substance by all ages in Canada. And that was sort of the case right across the board. They found alcohol had the highest reported use. Cannabis was the second highest used substance in terms of youth ages 15 to 19 and 20 to 24. Now, for individuals aged 25 and up, cannabis was the third most reported use substance following tobacco. And it's important to understand the impacts of cannabis because we know that's essential to minimize both the risks and the harms. And furthermore, one of the things that's noted here about tobacco use in a lot of these surveys is many surveys looked at alcohol and cannabis in terms of past 12-month use. Tobacco use was generally measured either in past 30-day or measuring if someone was a current or daily smoker. So the tobacco number was a little bit differently reported than some of the others. We found similar trends from the CTADs when we looked at the student tobacco, alcohol, and drug survey in 2018-2019. Again, cannabis was the second most reported substance after alcohol in grades 7 through 12. And increase of all substances was reported by grade level. So alcohol, we saw jump, cannabis, tobacco, and illicit drugs. So these numbers were growing consistently, and they're consistent, like I said, not just with youth, but with adults as well. The only difference being adult reported rates of tobacco use were slightly higher than rates of cannabis use. Now, we were curious if we were looking at use of cannabis versus different substances. We were also curious about using cannabis in combination with other substances. So specifically, we looked at the idea of using tobacco or alcohol in combination with cannabis. And what we found according to last year's Canadian Cannabis Survey was that Canadians reported being more likely to use alcohol in combination with cannabis than anything else. About 73% of people reported mixing alcohol with cannabis either rarely, sometimes, or often. And according to the CSTADs taken a couple years before, about 1 in 8 students between grades 7 to 12, or approximately 250,000 through representation, reported use of alcohol and cannabis on the same occasion at least once in the past 12 months. So like I said, alcohol was the most likely substance to be co-used with cannabis. Tobacco was the second highest, but the number was substantially lower. 68% of people reported never mixing cannabis with tobacco. 7% rarely, 8% sometimes, but 17% saying often. Now, mixing cannabis with other substances can be more harmful than using cannabis alone. For instance, some people may choose to mix tobacco and cannabis who may otherwise have never used tobacco. So there's also got to be considered not just the potential for risk of cannabis use or associated with cannabis use, which we'll discuss a little later, but the risks inherent to consuming or inhaling tobacco, as well as the risks that may pop up due to intoxication through alcohol and mixing alcohol with cannabis. So it's very important to understand, especially when having these conversations with youth, that a strategy to consider for harm reduction is if they do choose to use substances, it's generally a better idea to avoid mixing them if possible.
Absolutely, that's a great point that you just made, Steve. Now, another interesting question that these surveys looked into was how youth were consuming cannabis. We know that there's many different ways to get THC into the body. So what do we think is the most popular one among youth? Would it be eating, dabbing, smoking, or vaping? And I found that people have asked me quite a bit recently the difference between vaping and dabbing, because in action they look very similar. It's just blowing out smoke, right? The difference is how and what is being burned to create this reaction. So vaping is heating up dried flowers to cannabis to a point where combustion can occur. and what is blown out is vapor rather than smoke. Similarly, dabbing releases vapor as well, but what is being combusted is sticky oils that have extremely high concentrates of THC. So traditional forms of cannabis have anywhere between 0 to 20% THC, anything that you find like your regular button flower, but anything that is what they would call like hash, rosin, wax, any of these forms of dabs, they start off as high as 70% THC concentrations, so they're quite strong.
Mm-hmm. It's funny, actually, you mentioned that. I just saw someone asking the question panel what dabbing was. So
excellent. Now let's see let's look at our answers. 61% of our voters say that smoking is the most popular method of consumption of cannabis among Canadian youth, and I'm going to give it away and tell you that they are correct.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, one of the questions was asked about the demographic for youth. We were looking 15 to 24. We also looked at the CSTATs, looking grade 7 to 12. And what we found was in terms of methods of cannabis consumption, and there's a reason why I said 15 to 24 in one of the answers, but I'm also reporting here that the CSTATs looked grade 7 through 12, was that what we found was that the #1 form was indeed smoking. About 76% of youth grade 7 to 12 reported the form of method of cannabis consumption they used was smoking. Now, these numbers don't total 100% because some people reported multiple methods. So we saw eating was second, followed by vaporizing, then dabbing, looking at other forms here. Transdermal patches, you're looking at your, what are some of the other ones we're looking here? We're looking at the oils, we're looking at the oral syringes, and then finally the last one will be looking at drinking. Now, we were also curious if this is the trends in terms of youth consumption of cannabis products. We were curious that whether or not adults may look at the same sort of pattern of cannabis consumption. Now, the pattern wasn't really similar. It was almost identical. What we found was that smoking was the most reported across all ages, 16, 19, 20, 24, 25 plus, according to last year's CCS. Eating and food was second highest, followed by vaporizing, followed by dabbing, and then drinking was the fifth leading. Now, different methods of cannabis consumption, just like Andreas was alluding to, can mean that a person is using different levels of active ingredients in cannabis, particularly THC, but also other cannabinoids such as terpenes and CBD. Now, products with higher THC content may cause greater psychoactive effects, especially in youth under the ages of 25. Now, each method of consumption exposes the user to different risks, and it's important, again, to understand that each method is important in reducing its harms. So if we're looking at youth consuming, say, dried leaf and smoking and inhaling, there are risks to lung wellness and respiratory wellness when we look at things like dry cough, onset of bronchitis, et cetera, when it comes to smoking cannabis products. But when you're considering if an individual is thinking of using a dab, which, as Andreas was alluding to, can have 2 times or higher the quantity of THC or the potency of THC, this may be a different sort of risk to have to consider in terms of having conversation with youth. So it's not simply trying to have that conversation about whether they're using cannabis, but getting just considering what sorts of products they're using, and not just what youth are using, but also what parents are using. It's important for us as adults, as teachers, as leaders, to try to set a positive example. If we're trying to explain the risks associated with dab rigs to youth, but then we find ourselves using dabs instead of maybe a lower THC potency, this may lead to a little bit more of a complicated discussion.
That's a great remark that you just made, Steve, and this is a great way to bring up a very interesting question posed by the surveys as well. Are people aware of what's in the products that they're buying? So let's have a look. In 2020, what percentage of youth ages 16 to 19 reported uncertainty about the levels of THC and CBD that is in the products that they are consuming? Now, just as a quick recap, THC is the psychoactive component of the cannabis plant, which is responsible for that high feeling that people get. And CBD is thought to be associated with some of the therapeutical uses of the cannabis plant. More research is going into this recently, now that it has been deemed legal under a recreational status as well. So I think that that's where research is heading to explore some more benefits, therapeutically speaking.
Mm-hmm. This was one that really caught me off guard. I was really impressed that this question was posed by one of the surveys, by the way.
Yeah, precisely. The National Cannabis Survey and the Canadian Cannabis Survey have very thought-provoking questions, I find.
They really do. They really do. I give them a lot of credit for that.
Yeah. All right. So we have a lot of responses in. Let's see what our audience is thinking. 26% of our audience think that 24% of youth were unaware of the concentration percentages in their products. Was that the right answer, Steve?
Well, the majority actually said, and they would have been correct, that about 31% of youth 16 to 19 reported uncertainty, and that was the case. Now, if you want to be exact, it was 30.8% of teens aged 16 to 19 reported when asked that they did not know what the levels were of THC or CBD in the products that they consumed. This number was slightly lower for adults, 20 to 24, we saw 22.8, adults 25 and up, it was 24.2. But one thing of interest was that even though 30.8% said they didn't know the product or how much THC or CBD were in it, 35.5% of teens in the same age range reported that they chose products based on having a higher THC level and a lower CBD level. Now, again, as we've mentioned a couple times, the higher the THC content in a product, the greater the likelihood of experiencing adverse or perhaps unwanted effects and greater levels of impairment. And we also understand that youth under the ages of 25 that consume THC are at a greater risk of impaired brain development, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on. And we also have another webinar coming up a little bit later this year, looking specifically at the impact of cannabis use on adolescent brain development.
Now we're moving on to a bit of a bleak topic, but we wouldn't be doing a complete job talking about substance use if we didn't talk about the repercussions that come when it comes to driving. All right. So between 2012 and 2016, how many teens ages 16 to 19 that were killed in car crashes tested positive for cannabis? Would it be 1 in 3, 1 in 5, 1 in 10, or 1 in 20? And I don't want to sway too much the results of our poll, but whatever you're thinking, go higher.
Yeah. Now, I do like the fact that you noted that this is testing positive for cannabis. It didn't say testing positive necessarily for cannabis impairment, right?
Exactly. And we know that alcohol leaves your body within an average of 8 hours, but cannabis stays in the body for way longer, depending on each person's personal circumstances, like their consumption habits, the percentage of body fat in their body. So sometimes you could have not used cannabis in a while and still have lingering remnants of THC in your body.
Absolutely. We got a lot of response right now. Looks like we got about 3/4 of the vote in.
3/4. Let's go with this representation and see what they thought. So almost half of them think that it is 1 in 5. However, and I'm a little bit sad to tell you that the answer is 1 in 3.
Absolutely. The answer is indeed 1 in 3. According to the Traffic Injury Foundation, doing a study conducted funded by Desjardins Insurance, what they found was that approximately 1 in 3 youth between 2012 and 2016 killed in car crashes did test positive for cannabis in their system. And we also know that motor vehicle crashes are also the leading cause of death for youth between the ages of 15 to 24 in Canada, according to Stats Canada in a 5-year window. Cannabis has also been proven to decrease driving performance and reduce the ability to focus on motor skills, according to the National Institute on Drug Abuse last year. Now, some of the things that we consider when it comes to looking at impairment when it comes to driving is cannabis may reduce response time, it may reduce the ability to judge distance and judge speed, or react to sudden changes such as a car suddenly stopping in front of you, a light turning to red, or perhaps an animal or a pedestrian coming out on the street in front of you. Now, a CCSA study conducted back in 2013 in BC compared roadside survey fatalities with postmortem data on fatally injured drivers, and this survey reported that cannabis use alone increased the risk of a fatal collision by 5 times. The report also stated that cannabis use when combined with alcohol increased the risk of a fatal crash by 40 times. And in 2019, the Canadian Automobile Association, or CAA as most of us know them, reported that 1/4 of Canadians between the ages of 18 to 34 had driven while under the influence of cannabis or had reported traveling in a vehicle with a driver who had consumed or was impaired by cannabis. So a lot of data here, a lot of other studies we looked into.
Now, the Canadian Cannabis Survey wanted to know, and again, it's one of these very thought-provoking questions, which of the following was the most common reason provided by youth aged 20 to 24 when they were asked why they drove after using cannabis? And the options are quite interesting. I did not have an alternate transportation. I did not feel impaired. I did not think that I would get caught. I thought that I could drive carefully, or I did not have very far to go.
Yeah, this one was another one I thought was really interesting. Like I said, some of these questions I thought were really cool to read through.
Yeah, and the answer to this one is also really interesting.
Let's see what we've got. A lot of votes coming in. I see votes on everything too. This is good.
Yeah, we have very engaged audience today, Steve. So thanks everyone for participating very promptly. And lots of good questions being asked on the chat as well. So thank you for that. Keep them coming.
Absolutely, please do.
let's go with what we have here. 3/4 of our audience has answered. So
All right.
Most of them got the answer that was given by most youth, which is that they did not feel impaired.
Absolutely. The answer that we saw that came across as number one was youth saying that they drove after using cannabis because they didn't feel impaired. Now, this didn't say did they drive while under the influence. It just simply said did they drive after consuming. And what the CCS was generally measuring was either within 2 hours of consuming cannabis by smoking it or within 4 hours of consuming cannabis by eating it, just in case we're wondering when we look at the time range. The most common answer we found was 72.9% saying they didn't feel impaired, followed by not having to go very far, thinking they could drive carefully, not having alternate transportation, and about 1 in 7 believed that they would not get caught by police or law enforcement. Now, 2% of people in the CCS last year also reported that when they, not at the time, but reported that they had an interaction with law enforcement related to driving under the influence of cannabis while they were driving. So whether that was at a ride check, whether that was at a stop, whether that was at for any myriad of reasons, but 1 in 50 that had used within the past 12 months said that they had an interaction at some point. Now, again, the numbers that we see around not having to go very far, thinking they could drive carefully, or not having transportation, these really speak to the importance of harm reduction and safety when it comes to planning ahead with driving. And this is important for youth, but it is also important for adults as well, just to consider that you want to make sure that you plan a safe route. If cannabis is going to be consumed where you're going, or if you believe it might be, it's usually a good idea to designate a driver or look into alternate transportation.
And I think, Steve, on that note, that it's important to mention that because we did talk how cannabis lingers in everyone's body differently and it affects people differently, rather than focusing on like, oh, is cannabis use good or bad, or is it harmful or not? Adults can focus on having a conversation with youth around safe harm reduction strategies, like what you just said, designating a driver, arranging transportation that is not them driving, or being a passenger of an impaired driver. So that's where the conversation should be focused to.
Mm-hmm. And to speak a little bit about the idea of driving and being a passenger, we have a couple more survey questions to look at that as well. Next question, Andres, what do we got?
Now, do we think that youth are more or less likely than adults to report driving after consuming cannabis? Should be a quick vote.
It is a quick vote. A lot of votes.
Yeah, it's just 2 words. I feel like the last one we had more of different ideas that people would have been taking them a couple moments to gauge.
Yeah, maybe 3 seconds.
All right, let's go with what we have. And majority of our audience thinks that youth are more likely to report driving after consuming cannabis than adults, but we're very happy to tell you that it's the opposite.
In fact, what we found in most of the survey data was that youth were actually less likely than adults to report driving after consuming cannabis, particularly after legalization. But what we found was that youth ages 16 to 24 reported driving after consuming cannabis at a lower rate. Now, the Canadian Cannabis Survey looked at this, and youth ages 16 to 19 reported about 16% within 2 hours of smoking or vaporizing cannabis, or 4 hours of ingesting, but that number climbed with age. The 20 to 24, when it came to ingesting, was around the same, but the 25 and up, that number was slightly higher. Same with the number reporting driving within 2 hours of smoking. Now, the CCS also did report an overall decline in respondents reporting driving after consuming cannabis, which is also good news. In 2019, approximately 26% of respondents reported driving after consuming, but that number dropped to 22% in 2020. So the messaging around cannabis impaired driving, at least in what we're seeing in reporting data, does appear to be taking some effect, which is good.
Sorry, just answering a question on the chat. Next quick poll question, very simple, true or false. A passenger that also uses cannabis is more likely to report driving in or getting into a vehicle with a cannabis impaired driver.
Mm-hmm. What do we think about this one?
More than half has voted. Just going to give it a few more moments, Steve.
Okay. Looks like they're all voting kind of in one direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think this is going to change. Let's just show the results.
Okay.
Most people agree and say that it is true that a passenger who also uses cannabis is more likely to get into a vehicle with a cannabis impaired driver. And yeah, that checks out.
They would be correct, and that's what we found in the research. According to the CCS, we found that youth between the ages of 16 to 19 were actually about 4 times more likely to report being a passenger in a vehicle driven by someone that had consumed cannabis if the passenger themselves also reported being a cannabis user. And adults ages 20 to 24 were 3 times more likely. So I mentioned a moment ago that youth and people in general do seem to be learning the risks of driving themselves while impaired by cannabis. However, youth in particular do still remain more likely than adults to get into a vehicle with a cannabis impaired driver. Now, one of the things that really is important to discuss with youth as well is when we're talking about impairment and we're talking about the idea of designating a driver, some people may say, well, I don't feel it even though 2 people had it at the same time, or it wears off for me quicker. The answer is there is no real magic number of how long it takes to no longer feel the effects of cannabis impairment. And this has been reported across multiple planes. Some people may say, well, after 6 hours or after 4 hours, it may be if you've consumed a cannabis product. However, the drowsiness caused by cannabis products can take up to 24 hours before that effect alleviates. So it's really important to understand, again, if cannabis is going to be part of your plans in an evening during the day, that you should look at designating someone who has not consumed, period. Even if maybe they stopped a couple of hours before you, or if you've stopped a couple of hours before them, there's not really a magical number in terms of hours. It's just best to designate someone who's not been using. Now, going back to the statement here about being a passenger with cannabis impaired driver, we found that youth ages 18 to 24 reported about 3 times higher instances of being a passenger in a car operated by a driver that had consumed cannabis within 2 hours of driving, both before as well as after legalization. So again, it's important to remind youth simply that if they choose to use, they should do so after designating a sober driver or by planning safe travel if necessary.
Okay, so we're well aware that driving under the influence of cannabis is a violation under the Motor Vehicle Act and perhaps under the Criminal Act, depending on the severity of the fault. Let's have a look at what other violations can be committed under the Cannabis Act. So in 2019, what percentage of violations of the Cannabis Act involved youth possession of cannabis? Would it be 21%, 18%, 12%, or 10%?
Mm-hmm. Now, when we say violations, we don't just mean youth-related violations, we mean violations overall.
Okay, half of our votes are in, and we're doing pretty good with timing. We're only 1 or 2 minutes behind with our whole schedule, but I might be starting to close the poll questions a little bit quicker now just to catch up.
Okay, sure thing.
So we see that 52% of our attendance said that 18% of these violations were around youth possession of cannabis. I think that the right figure is 12%. Is it 1 in 8 violations, Steve?
You're exactly right. So according to 2019 Stats Canada's police reported cannabis offenses in Canada, approximately 1 in 8 violations of the Cannabis Act reportedly involved youth possession of cannabis. This was actually the 3rd most commonly reported violation of the Act in 2019. The highest being importation and exportation of cannabis, possession of over 30 grams or of illicit cannabis by an adult. 3rd, like I said, possession of over 5 grams by youth. And 4th was possession for the purpose of selling at 10%. Now, we were kind of curious after that, if there's this rate being 3rd highest in terms of all reported violations being related to youth possession, we were curious what other sorts of youth-related violations could we look at under the Cannabis Act? So we saw possession of over 5 grams was the highest. We looked at the use of young person to commit a cannabis-related offense. Now, this would be the idea that someone who is a legal age may be asking a youth who is underage to traffic cannabis for them, to sell cannabis for them, or to help set up a deal. So that's where we have that use of a young person. We looked at sale of cannabis to a youth, distribution to a youth, distribution to an organization by a youth, or cultivating, propagating, or harvesting cannabis by a youth. So the number one that we saw by far was indeed possession, and 2nd highest being use of a young person to commit.
Bear with me just 1 second, Steve.
No problem. Do you want me to ask this question since you're doing the poll question or the response there?
Yeah, go for it.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we've seen in terms of legalization is there have been sort of changes in the way that violations of cannabis-related offenses are structured, right? So what we were curious is whether or not legalization has resulted in more or fewer charges to youth for cannabis-related violations. And we'll see what you guys think. I can launch the poll here, Andreas. So I'm going to launch that. What do you think?
Thanks, Steve. Back on track.
No problem. No problem. I appreciate you doing the question panel. We've got a big group of people on today, so
And they're asking really good questions. So I want
really are. They really are. I love high engagement. So, all right. So let's see what we're at here in terms of percentage. We've got about 2/3 of the vote in. I'm going to give you guys about 5 seconds. We'll close it in 4, 2, 1. All right. Poll is now closing. Okay. So at first I was interested because the number was skewing towards more, but what we actually saw was that more people as we got into this were reporting the number being fewer. So 64% saying fewer, 36 saying more. The answer is fewer, but it's a bit of a complicated one, and I'll explain why. Between 2015 and 2019, the rate at which youth were charged for cannabis-related offenses decreased from 58.7% down to 38.3%. Now, since the Cannabis Act was passed in 2018, youth found in violation of the Cannabis Act are less likely to be charged for a cannabis-related offense than they were before legalization. So in case you're wondering, if we look at cannabis-related charges before the Cannabis Act, these would have been just sort of cannabis-related drug charges before the Cannabis Act had them set aside specifically for cannabis. Now, one thing that we did find in the research, and this is something we are currently researching further for our future workshop on stigma and mental health literacy, is that despite similar rates of cannabis use amongst across different racial groups, our BIPOC demographics, so our Black, Indigenous, and people of color, those communities are disproportionately stopped, searched, arrested, prosecuted, and incarcerated for cannabis possession. So this is something that we are continuing to look into because we want to look into sort of what we can do to sort of decrease stigma, improve a little bit more sort of tolerance and inclusivity. This is something that we want to make sure we can educate youth on, but we did want to note that we did see this in the research, but we're looking into it further so that we can have a more engaged and informed discussion about it without, kind of just saying it and moving on. That's why I wanted to acknowledge that. Now, one thing I will note as well is that the amount of violations in 2019 of cannabis-related violations was actually higher than the amount of reported violations in 2016. They were very close, but what was happening was that the violations were less likely to result in charges. Why is that, Andreas?
Now, one of the goals of the Cannabis Act was to not only to keep cannabis away from the hands of youth, but also to reduce criminal charges. And it does give officers the discretion of enacting different measures that may not necessarily give a youth a criminal record, because we know that this has very negative consequences on a youth's life developmental outcome, because it will limit their ability to access jobs, housing, and other circumstances that are necessary for quality of life. So again, it is the Act acts as a way to ensure that there's legislation around it and that there's compliance, but also it does invite officers to have a more, what would be the right word for this, restorative approach rather than punitive.
Absolutely. And shifting away from sort of that punitive kind of just say no demeanor towards more harm reduction or education or restorative practice, it does reduce the barriers towards youth, young adults, and Canadians overall in being able to sort of continue to work towards a healthier and better place overall. Now, when does cannabis use become a problem? Well, we're not just saying that as soon as you use cannabis, it is a problem. That's not what we want to say at all. But we do know that cannabis use can become a problem when it begins to impact a person's life in a negative way. And so what we did was we sort of look at use, substance use, cannabis use on a bit of a spectrum. And we sort of based this on one that we looked at from the University of Victoria's Office of Student Life, sort of looking at things on a spectrum. Some people may choose not to use cannabis, and that is still part of the spectrum. It does avoid nearly all of the risks. You're not going to see a lot of negative effects of cannabis use if you're not using cannabis. Now, some people may choose to use cannabis. There may be some risk associated, but if these people are setting limits, if they're using recreationally with friends during free time, they're in a good headspace when they're using, they're avoiding driving, they're avoiding mixing with other substances, these would be individuals who are still practicing harm reduction. There's few negative effects. Then we see that sort of possibility of risky or problematic use or dependent use. In the risky side, we may see people using cannabis regularly. It begins to have sort of an adverse effect on their relationships or losing interest in other activities. And that point of dependency or cannabis use disorder would be when cannabis feels less like a choice and it becomes sort of a main or a primary coping strategy to deal with stressful or negative situations. People may find themselves breaking laws or getting into trouble as a result of cannabis use. And of course, there's the increased risk of physical or psychological effects. Now, what's important to understand about the spectrum is there's no guarantee that someone who doesn't use or uses low at a low risk, quote, will become dependent. That's not what we're saying. This is something that someone can shift on. Someone could see an increase in risk. They could see a decrease in risk. It's not just a one-way street, okay? Now, we also looked into the signs of problematic cannabis use. So we talk about when does it become a problem. Andreas, what kind of signs are we talking about here?
Right. So I think we have to look at health from different spheres. So we're going to look at health in terms of physical, emotional, behavioral, or psychological health. If you want to pop all four on the slide, Steve, right away, that's okay.
Sure.
It's a very content-heavy slide, so I'm just going to focus on signs that we as adults can identify in youth very quickly in case we're trying to detect problem cannabis use among the youth around us. So for physical signs, would it be something like unexplained fatigue or sleepiness throughout the day, or changes in their eating habits and appetite? For emotional, would be perhaps poor performance at school or increased interest in high excitement and low effort activities. This is a really good trait to look for. Or if youth are retrieving and becoming isolated. In terms of behavior, anything that is related to breaking the law regarding cannabis, or driving knowing that it is not a safe thing to do, or spending more time and money that someone would want to on using cannabis. For psychological signs of problem cannabis use, we have the inability of stopping despite wanting to do so, and using cannabis as an escape, or as I mentioned earlier, as an umbrella coping mechanism for anything and everything.
Absolutely, absolutely. Next poll question.
All right, so what percentage of teenagers using cannabis in Canada will meet the criteria for cannabis dependence in their lifetime? This is actually a condition that has been diagnosed and conceptualized besides or in addendum to substance use disorder. There's specifically cannabis use disorder. All right, so let's see what our voters think. Most people think that 17% of teenagers will meet these criteria. I think that 17% is the figure for the overall, it is the figure for youth. The overall population's figure is 9%, but if youth starts at a younger age, that likelihood of creating a dependency will rise highly. And I'm sorry, Steve, that I took the floor from you were typing an answer.
No, you nailed it perfectly. We know that about 1 in 11 or 9% of cannabis users overall would meet criteria for a cannabis use disorder, but early cannabis use would see an increase to around 17%. And about 25 to 50% of daily users will report CUD-related symptoms. Now, this is something, we saw this number and we want to just kind of throw this up really quickly. It's the idea that the evidence that cannabis use disorder rates being higher for people who begin using during adolescence, this is something that's been reported recently, but it's also been reported in different ways over the last 25 years, tracing back as far as 1994. So that idea that youth onset use of cannabis would be somehow connected or sort of show a link to a higher likelihood of developing a cannabis use disorder. This is not a new concept, but it is something that has been consistently reported in data. So if we look at risk factors, and there are so many that can be listed here that contribute to cannabis use disorder. These could be things such as initiation at a younger age, a personal or peer use of tobacco or other drugs. It could be regular use or antisocial behavior. It could be isolation. Andreas alluded to using cannabis as a coping mechanism. Another thing is the idea of norm misperceptions, and we talked about this. If youth believe their friends are using more than they actually are, that may shift their decision to use. It could be causes in academic challenges or a lack of involvement in community, or even pre-existing or underlying mental health disorders. Now, if there are all of these risk factors listed, it's also important that we try to consider the protective factors. And some of the protective factors, according to the World Drug Report, include things like caregiver involvement and monitoring, just being a part of your youth's lives. It doesn't mean you have to stare at them and watch them all day, every single day, but it just means being involved, asking questions, getting to know them. We look at the idea of things like promoting development of coping skills, emotional regulation, the idea of ensuring physically safe environments and socially inclusive environments, access to health and social services, as well as safe neighborhoods and overall a quality school environment. Youth need an idea of a quality structured environment where they're going to thrive. Now, there are various risks associated with youth cannabis use. We know the first one would be the idea of the possibility of an impact to academic performance. Youth that begin using cannabis at least once a month are more likely to skip class and 2 to 4 times less likely to complete homework, according to a 2017 Compass study. And the Canadian Cannabis Survey reported last year that youth that use cannabis regularly actually report being less likely to finish high school or obtain a degree. We see issues around impaired brain development, particularly with youth under the age of 25. Hospitalization rates in cannabis. Cannabis use was documented in approximately 40% of hospitalizations of youth ages 10 to 24 in 2017, 2018. We look at the legal consequences associated with youth underage who try to buy, sell, or possess cannabis, may be charged under the Youth Criminal Justice Act. We looked at the risks earlier around impaired driving, difficulty with relationships. This was actually a report from 2017 CCSA that youth actually reported increased conflict with romantic partners, family, and friends regarding their cannabis use, as well as physical health risks such as chronic bronchitis, coughing, wheezing, tightness in the chest, especially with inhaling or smoking cannabis products, as well as the mental health risks. Rates of cannabis use are about 2 to 4 times higher amongst people with schizophrenia. And we also know that adolescents who report regularly using cannabis during teenage years, especially with higher THC products, are more likely to report mental and social health issues. So Andreas, if we were going to speak to youth about cannabis, what are some strategies we can really promote for them?
For sure, since caregiver involvement is considered a protective factor in cannabis use dependency, it's important that we ask ourselves, what can we do to help? Right? So the first thing that we can do is what we're doing here today, educating ourselves. Now, make sure that when you have conversations with youth, you're also empathetic. Your knowledge is not going to go very far without a little bit of empathy. And when you're ready, talk about it in a comfortable setting. This means make sure that neither you nor the youth are impaired by cannabis at the time, or that you're not doing it in a place that is going to belittle or minimize the lived experience of a youth. Now, when you decide to have those conversations, be intentional about what you want to accomplish with them. So make sure that you set out clear goals before and that you work together to achieve common understanding. Mm-hmm. Now, focus on safety and well-being, again, instead of being punitive and being judgmental. Establish limits and understand consequences. Help youth find healthy adaptive coping strategies. And we've talked a little bit about that, so I'm going to move on from that. And build trust. This is very important. Refrain from lecturing. They say that if a youth stops listening, you should probably stop talking.
I always love that line. It's a very good one.
Now, be sure to set a positive example, especially if you're an adult who uses cannabis. Make sure that you're displaying like the right times to do it, that you don't do it before driving, or that you're not using very high concentrated amounts. Be willing to help, even if cannabis is involved. You are the adult and the responsible person in any given situation. And lastly, stay connected, respect their independence, and ask questions. Youth are more likely to want to have a conversation with you if they feel like their sense of identity is being respected.
Absolutely, and I like the idea of asking questions. It's a very important one. Now, there are resources available, and you can see these in the handout section of the panel on the right-hand side. If you click on the handouts drop-down, if you click right there, you'll see that we have 2 handouts there. One are some provincial resources that you can contact if you or someone else you know is experiencing issues with cannabis use, as well as some educational resources designed for adults and parents supporting youth, particularly the CSSDP Sensible Cannabis Education Toolkit, CCSA's Talking Pot with Youth, and Drug Free Kids' Cannabis Talk Kit. All 3 are very well regarded. And in fact, I know CSSDP's new Cannabis Education Toolkit should be coming out later this year, I believe. Memory serves me right, I think it's coming in the summer. So, always good stuff to see. So, every time I click on the panel, it makes me bump away. Some of the other resources you can always consider are accessing our Educational Knowledge Hub, the Youth Cannabis Knowledge Hub, as well as EENet's Evidence Exchange Network, as well as the Cannabis Knowledge Exchange Hub. Always helpful resources for professionals and adults in general, connecting service providers and other stakeholders across Canada with credible evidence-based information, which can be accessed at cannabisknowledgehub.ca for the KE Hub, and EENet you can access as well online. And as well, you'll see this map looks extremely populated, but you will find these resources in the handout section on the bottom of the page. So looking at provincial providers that offer support available across Canada. And the final 2 we like to mention, Good to Talk is only available for Ontario and Nova Scotia. They offer a wide range of issues that may be impacting mental health and well-being, but Kids Help Phone is available nationally across Canada. It's available 24/7 for youth under the age of 20. If you know any youth that may be looking for someone to talk to and they're not sure who they can reach out to, we always recommend it's a good idea to contact Kids Help Phone. All right, so the very last thing before we wrap up, we are 3 minutes over, but we are the very last thing before we wrap up. We want to thank all of you for coming in. We want to make sure that we explain some of those harm reduction strategies to remember when you're speaking with youth. Number 1, as you've been doing today, you want to educate yourself about cannabis use. Know the facts and the misconceptions and how to clarify those. If you know a youth is considering using, you may want to suggest they limit use or delaying altogether until they turn 25. It's important for youth and people in general, if they're using cannabis, that they also make time to do the other things that they enjoy, so that they're not looking at cannabis as a sole source of joy, that they're still doing other things that make them happy. That way they can still use and be less likely to experience sort of negative symptoms or effects. Perhaps avoid using if you or your family has a history of mental health disorders. Make sure to plan for transportation or designate a driver. We spoke about that at length. If you're using cannabis, look for products with low THC content. And I think most importantly with youth, if they are choosing to use, they want to use in a safe place with people that they trust. You don't want them, thinking that they have to go and hide somewhere where they're going to be uncomfortable and build up more stigma and build up more discomfort. If they're thinking of using, they need to find someplace that's safe. And same with an adult. If you're planning on using, you probably want to use around people that you trust in case anything negative or unpleasant comes up. But thank you very much for joining us today. You can stay connected with YCAP. We will be posting many more webinars and presentations in the coming weeks and months. Some of the resources we have coming up are a general awareness presentation for youth around Cannabis 101. We have an ongoing presentation coming up for adults about parental preventative skills when it comes to cannabis use. 3 of our other modules include adolescent brain development, mental health literacy in cannabis, as well as stigma mental health in cannabis. You can also access youth engagement opportunities. Feel free to look into joining some of our partnership committees or look into collaborating with the provincial EACs on a community cannabis awareness project. And if you're looking to do so, you can either visit our website at youthcannabisawareness.ymcagta.org or send us an email anytime at YCAP, that is YCAP, at ymcagta.org. Do you have anything else to add, Andreas, before we wrap up?
I think you hit all the points, Steve. I just wanted to say on behalf of the Youth Cannabis Awareness Program here in YMCA, we're very, very happy to have had you, all of you join us today on this presentation. And again, our hats go off to all of you for your amazing engagement, for all the questions that you asked, and for all the comments that you're popping up on the questions on the chat right now, giving us thanks and props for the hour that we just spent together. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all very, very much. We hope that you enjoyed the presentation, and you will also be getting some of the handouts and resources and links to them available in the follow-up email to this presentation. Otherwise, I think I see some people are starting to drop off. A lot of thank yous. Thank you all very, very much. Again, miigwech for the Anishinaabe community, as we see here. Thank you very, very much. I see Stephanie also asked that you can reach out to the Youth Substance Awareness Program, or YSAP, which is another Y program supporting youth with substance use, particularly in and around the GTA. Although the services are available as well for anyone else looking. But yeah, a lot of content.
And thank you everyone who stayed a couple of extra minutes with us. We did go over our session for just a few minutes, but thank you so much for staying with us. And thank you so much, Steve, for being an amazing co-presenter.
Same to you, Andreas. I always love doing this presentation with you. You're very well versed and you're very good at keeping things on track. I can sometimes get a little caught up in the research.
All good. That's what we're here for.
But again, excellent job, Andreas. And for the participants today, thank you so much for joining. You were a wonderful group. We got some awesome questions. All right, so we're going to close it up here. And again, we hope that you all enjoy a safe and happy and wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Bye now.